Space Exploration plus Factorio 2 is one of the longest and most difficult mods for Factorio. I set a challenge to beat the game before Space Age, aka Factorio 2.0 releases, and ladies and gentlemen, we got him. I started in March and ended on August 30th with an in-game time of 543 hours over the course of 6 months. I made a series about this, and at 32 hours of gameplay per 1 hour of content, the runtime is still 17 hours for the series. The series is linked in the description, by the way, if you're interested, just saying. I'm not the first nor the fastest person to complete this run, but according to Reddit experts, which, yes, that statement is as funny as it sounds, it takes the average person around 600 to 1,000 hours to complete. The speedrun times seem to be around 100 hours, so going as fast as humans have figured out how to do as of yet still takes over 4 real-life days. Compared to non-MMO or gambling Steam games, this is absurdly long. On the one hand, Space Exploration is one of the most overall attractive mods, even if you knew nothing about the game. You're exploring space. I don't need to say anything else. The thought of expanding the admittedly brief base game of Factorio to building rockets and spaceships, setting up colonies on other planets that have unique biomes and resources, it's such a natural continuation of launching a spaceship where vanilla Factorio otherwise abruptly ends. It might seem like an obvious idea, but if you've ever played Space Exploration, it's apparent that the creators took this idea very seriously, and there is a surprising amount of quality and polish for a free add-on. Mix this with Factorio 2, one of the most popular and accessible overhaul mods that hints at your alien background and spices up many parts of the game with an overhauled research system, new ways to enrich and use resources, powerful weapons, and even a new resource. Space Exploration and Factorio 2 together, usually referred to as K2SE, should be a slam dunk, right? Isn't spending 600 hours in Factorio what life is all about? Well, my long tenure with this mod has yielded me a ton of opinions, and it's complicated. Most people don't have the time or motivation to plow through 600 hours to find out for themselves, so I wanted to share them in depth here. I'm going to sequentially go through my playthrough and try to cover everything these mods have to offer, from the amazing to the terrible.
Other side. Oh my.
There's one thing I want to get absolutely clear though. The people who made this mod made it out of passion for the game. They made this free product for us to experience, and overall it is a stunning accomplishment that this exists. If I have negative opinions on something, it is in no way, shape, or form a negative opinion of the people who made this mod. They should be given a tremendous amount of respect for allowing people to play this game. My opinions are my opinions, and there is absolutely nothing stating the creators should have a goal to acquiesce to any of my opinions, nor should there be. At the same time, I am a bit of an expert at this point, and I know there are inevitably people out there who are going to agree with my opinions. Finally, I'm going to cover everything in these mods, so there will be spoilers, and I won't warn you again. If you like these types of videos, algorithm interaction is encouraged. Thank you. The game starts out like a vanilla playthrough. You'll notice that smelting recipes are slower and require more resources at 20 ore to make 15 plates of iron and copper respectively, instead of vanilla's 1 ore equals 1 plate. This is a Factorio change, and I think it's overall good. Smelting at the start is slow, so making it slower just pushes you to make slightly more furnaces. Later in the game, the inefficiency of this recipe will push you toward enriching your ores and eventually making ingots, which are more than 50% more efficient than vanilla's recipes while stacking better as well. I like that you are encouraged and nudged to upgrading your smelting processes, but not forced. One of the strongest parts of vanilla Factorio is the freedom with how you can do almost anything. You'll find that K2SE has a handful of mechanics that essentially force you to do something, but for now, most things are very normal. Most things, except the burner phase. With the addition of burner assemblers, this phase challenges you to feed the assemblers and inserters with coal for a short time by locking power generation slightly farther ahead in the tech tree than usual. While it's novel at first, I came to find it annoying. I'm not a fan of refactoring, and this essentially adds an additional layer of refactoring once you get power and need to swap out the burner assemblers for electric ones. Later on, it also means that the assembling of, well, assemblers takes one more step than usual because you need to start with burner assemblers. After you automate the process more than once, it really feels like filler. It's not a challenge to add the burner assemblers in the crafting chain, it's just annoying. I would go as far as to say almost anything that adds time between the early game and launching your first rocket is unnecessary. I know that this is space exploration and Factorio 2, not just space exploration, but I think shifting aspects of Factorio 2 into space is generally better than extending the early game on Navis. In my experience, space exploration really is the key here. I was personally most engaged with the things I did off-planet. The burner phase is the first early game extender offender, and the next are the new intermediates such as automation cores, iron beams, multiple types of motors, and inserter parts. Compared to vanilla, many recipes are more expensive, require more intermediates, and are harder to group together spatially as a result of their more complex input chains. Trains are also delayed, and you're actually pushed into a fairly challenging belt mastery phase. I don't know if that was the intent, but it sure extends the early game, and therefore I don't think it's necessary. To complicate things further, you need to crush stone to utilize a new resource, sand.
I don't like sand.
I don't like it early in the game for the same reason as everything else so far. Sand really slows things to a crawl early though by increasing the number of early smelting arrays needed by 2, one for glass and one for silicon. 2 smelting arrays might not sound like a lot, but each line needs the raw resource plus coal to do the smelting, and it takes more time and space to set up than you might think. It's worth noting that the standard way of playing the game, a main belt, is much less effective at handling all the new resources than it is in vanilla. Later in the game, I actually like sand. It's a byproduct from many advanced resource processes and is very versatile, being able to provide the aforementioned glass and silicon, several other high-level recipes including pyroflux, and even landfill if you need to fill in water tiles or just make your excess sand take up less space. At this point, you should have trains though, which helps, but it's also on top of whatever belt monstrosity you've made to handle all the previous crafting. Electronic components are a new intermediate necessary for red circuits, again slowing us down. One of their inputs is plastic, which comes from oil processing, which is mostly the same as vanilla, except the first oil processing recipe only yields petroleum, which I actually kind of like. It means the first time you process oil, you don't have to worry about setting up light and heavy oil handling, making it much more accessible for noobs. There's just one problem: delaying light and heavy oil products is slowing us down. You're also introduced to core mining, a way to generate an infinite amount of many basic resources. I am mixed on this concept. On one hand, I love how unique it is and think it helps smooth out the resource acquisition for the rest of the game. I was frequently coming back to Navis, the starting planet, to make more mines for copper, iron, stone, and uranium, which becomes very monotonous. Core mining helps alleviate that, and without it, the number of mines I would have needed to set up would have been much worse. I also just think it's cool, so that's worth something. On the other hand though, core mining exposes an issue with balancing, giving an infinite amount of resources for a flat power cost that only becomes more and more affordable undermines the process of finding mines in the first place. In base Factorio, I love looking for and setting up mining outposts. The process of finding and setting up the mines isn't the issue, it's the runtime of the mod. Setting up dozens of mines for each resource is the problem. If the mod didn't drag on as long as it does, it wouldn't need a core miner to replace an otherwise enjoyable task, which left a weird taste in my mouth. Additionally, we are still fairly early, and this core miner will spit out rare metals, pyroflux, and mineral water, all resources with no usage for a long time. Pyroflux's first recipe is to make rocket fuel. Rare metals are only used for electric miners too until purple circuits, and mineral water is a mistake. Mineral water's first recipe that I remember is lithium, I think. I don't know, I don't respect mineral water enough to fact check this. Part of the reward of beating this mod is not looking at the purple mineral water icon anymore. Anyway, none of these recipes showed up before my 50-hour mark, so they just piled up in warehouses while I contemplated deleting the contents of the warehouse before it overflowed. Overall though, I think core mining is cool, and I love the creative new direction it takes in resource gathering. Instead of a fixed supply you can mine at a variable rate, you have an infinite supply you can mine at a fixed rate. Very cool. You'll also notice that science packs have been replaced with science cards, needing a blank data card as an input. Data cards are very analogous to the science packs in vanilla in terms of what they provide, they're just sort of more expensive. This one is the most understandable. Science cards are a Factorio 2 edition, and you consciously downloaded Space Exploration plus Factorio 2, so it should be expected. At the same time, they're slowing us down. And I imagine there's a way to add these processes to space, or at least make them cheaper on Navis. Steel now needs to be made with coke instead of just smelting iron twice. Coke is made by smelting coal with wood, and wood can now be grown in greenhouses with water, which is infinite and free. But don't let that fool you. Coke might be more realistic to actual steel making process in real life, but I'd much rather just be smelting iron ore twice. I don't feel like anything gameplay-wise is added by making steel harder to make, and I don't respect saying it's realistic as a valid reason either. Factorio suspends my disbelief to a large degree, and I love that. For everything you try to make realistic about this mod, there are about 1,000 non-realistic things. We're going to make spaceships and teleporters, and most unrealistic of all, we make perfectly uniform iron plates with no deformities and a 0% error rate. That is by no means a reason to change that, and if you make a mod that introduces manufacturing error into this game, I will... Okay, my lawyer says I can't say that, but I will. Making things more realistic isn't inherently bad just when it makes a process worse to work with. Being damaged by touching uranium was a cute gimmick that was possibly funny the first time, then unbelievably annoying the following 9,000 times it came up. So screw your realism, I actively want perfect fantasy factory game, it's better this way, please make things less realistic. And what's more unrealistic than a massive warehouse that holds literal tons of resources? That actually sounds incredibly realistic, but warehouses are incredibly well designed. At 6x6 and 512 inventory slots, they seem a little overkill at first, like maybe you can use the space better? But the realization that this simple warehouse is the perfect tool is the best extended release drug I have ever taken. 6x6 means it is the same length as a train, so they line up perfectly, leaving a one-tile gap between adjacent train cars. It's not immediately apparent, but this is literal perfection. I would go as far as to say LTN or logistic train network is necessary for this mod, and LTN allows for drop-offs and pickup stations handling multiple types of resources. With normal chests, you'd run into all sorts of problems, so the fact that they are consolidated in a single building is extremely handy. Their large size means they can handle a large number of resources, whether you mean a lot of one resource or a small amount of many resources, and that one tile gap between each warehouse is exactly what is needed to add inserters to transfer resources between warehouses. Their large area is also a strength, allowing many inserters or loaders to unload simultaneously and filter different resources to where they need to go easily. Every single aspect of warehouses is perfect, 10 out of 10, so seemingly simple and yet so perfect. I also mentioned loaders, which are a nice complement to warehouses. In this mod, they are far more expensive than usual. For example, a yellow loader needs 50 green circuits as well as a hefty iron cost. They aren't necessary, you can just have two inserters load a belt, but the belt won't be fully saturated and the two inserters take up more space than the one loader, and the loader is such a clean solution, and by default has 5 filter slots, so they're really nice. The fact that they're more expensive isn't that big of a deal. It pushes you to only use them when necessary with high volume items that you want efficient throughput with, like iron or copper, so I think it's okay. The key here is that they have an alternative, so making them more expensive doesn't remove functionality, it just changes the cost calculation for a slight upgrade. We almost never used loaders in the early game, and that's why you're watching me set up solar panels and accumulators instead. These haven't changed much from vanilla, aside from the base overall needing more solar panels to fuel your factory that is much bigger and much more power hungry than usual. I love solar, so blueprinting literal tens of thousands of solar panels and accumulators across the run felt awesome, but the real solution here is to use nuclear power plants. They generate a base of 250 megawatts of power, which is much higher than in vanilla, and even multiply this bonus when placed adjacent to other power plants. We didn't make nuclear power on Navis for quite a bit, but in the early game, it is the best way to generate power. Because this is a buff, it doesn't go into the slowing us down category, and although I personally am not a fan of setting up nuclear power, I think it's a good change. You can easily ignore nuclear power and even uranium entirely in vanilla, so making uranium more useful feels very deserved. Eventually, you'll get to satellite rockets. These will not take you to space, but they will return data necessary for making yellow science, the last science before we go to space. You have access to construction and logistic bots at this point with storage and passive provider chests, but importantly, not requester chests. These are locked behind the second science you make in space and will be locked away for quite a while. Without requester chests, the entire logistics processes of your base need to work with only trains and belts. For the most part, this should already be the case, but for expensive or low throughput, high input cost items like any type of assembler, chemical station or furnace, logistic train stops, rocket silos, things like that, this is a huge pain. Therefore, bots are really only useful for supplying and cleaning out your inventory and repairing buildings, which is still helpful on its own, but requester chests are sorely missed. To add insult to injury, bots have a chance of crashing if there are more than 50 of them in the network, and the chance is dependent on the robot interference of the planet you are on, which on Navis is moderate to low. I sort of understand the reason for doing so. First, limiting bots means less of an impact on your CPU if you have a multitude of bot networks on many planets. And when used correctly, bots also tend to make a lot of production problems much easier. But I fundamentally disagree with this decision. First, I love flying robots. They are cool. I want more of them. I want them everywhere. They enhance the aesthetic. Their uses are unique, and most importantly, I don't think they're overpowered. If you try to shift your smelting arrays to have 100% bot fed ore and 100% exported and delivered, it might work alright. Then if you do the same thing with a different ore like copper, it'll work okay, but you'll notice both processes start to slow down a little bit. Then if you want to start assembling iron gears and copper wire, again, it will work, but for these items needed in higher quantities, they'll all have their throughput reduced based on the number of things automated in the network. Also, if your bot network gets bigger in area, everything it tries to supply will get slower again because bots that are far away are just as likely as nearby bots to be chosen for a logistic task. Trains and belts do not have these complications. They just work well with high throughput items and send them where they need to go, no questions asked. Even in vanilla, where things are simplified immensely, it has never been more optimal to replace everything with bots. Trains and belts always have their uses. I mentioned this at the beginning, but logistics robots' best use is low throughput, high input cost items. Making these items with belts is an absolute pain, and it feels like a waste of time. You end up with a large spaghetti pile that indeed makes chemical stations, but is only used a few times per hour. So for these reasons, I think locking requester chests behind space science just complicates and bloats the early game in a frustrating, slow way. In any case, your bloated train belt pasta factory can now investigate the heavens after launching your first navigation satellite by pressing N. The interface is a little clunky at first. It's like the map view, but you sort of feel locked into what you're looking at. But as time goes on, the satellite view becomes a critical part of your K2SE diet, and I think it's a wonderful addition. But for right now, a big menu pops up and you can now look at any planet you have a satellite around, which for right now is just the space around your planet. Experiencing this for the first time was awesome. You get to look around at all the debris that's up there. There's a water ice mine, there's super fast belts, big solar panels, tons of scrap everywhere. There's so much to uncover. I was so excited to visit. But as you might expect, there's some work to do. I consider these the 4 mini bosses of the early game: heat shielding, rocket control units, low density structure, and rocket fuel. Each have high input costs, slow crafting times, and are needed to launch a rocket to the moon. The final bosses here are cargo rocket sections and space capsules, each needing the mini bosses and then some to be crafted, excluding rocket fuel. Space capsules also need 50 solar panels and accumulators, so they are no joke, and cargo rocket sections are absurd. On top of 3 of the 4 mini bosses, their full crafting chain includes fast inserters, iron chests, storage tanks, and red circuits. Disgusting. After making a very expensive cargo rocket silo, you'll notice that you need 100 of the very expensive cargo sections, 1 space capsule, and around 50,000 liquid rocket fuel per launch. Unsurprisingly, this is where things really slowed to a crawl. Launching this rocket needs 7 processes, each with 4 inputs, and each input is around 5 to 8 of whatever it needs, and the inputs can be things like liquid storage tanks and chests, and the space capsules need 100 solar panels and accumulators. It's just so brutal. And yes, I know in real life it's expensive to launch a rocket. We already discussed my feelings on reality. Go play Kerbal Space Program. My problem is that before getting to this point, my only goal, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm in a game called Explore Space, is to explore space, and I've already been here for 50 hours, not exploring space. I'm just playing a more complicated Factorio that seems to want to tie my hands behind my back because, so help me God, I use a tool like a main belt or a logistic bot to solve a problem. This is where marketing of all things comes into play. See, the game is called Space Exploration, and what I got was Factorio Dark Souls. I know that K2 is part of this and is slowing us down with the more expensive research, but I've played Space Exploration without K2 before, and you have the same problem, but it's a little faster to get through. I just want to do the space things. I've played normal Factorio, I get it. If we want space challenge, that's fine, but why don't we call it that? I feel that the 550 hours it took me to play through this, and I was below average, mind you, is so far off the scale. At this point, I'm beating a dead horse, but the early game is so restrictive and bloated. Let's quickly review all of the changes. More expensive and slower smelting, burner phase, trains are later in the tech tree, additional intermediates, sand, more expensive recipes, especially science, restricted oil processing, steel requires coke, uranium proximity damage, delayed requester chests, robot attrition, launching a rocket is even more complicated and expensive. Huh, these all have something in common.
They're slowing us down.
Wait, is there anything positive in here? Ah, yes. All is forgiven. In all seriousness, there are a few things like cheaper processing units and more effective nuclear power that help, but the first wing of the game, preparing for that first launch into space, it's a real 70-hour slog that I would love to be able to do in a fraction of that time. The first trip to the moon is really exciting. Cargo rockets hold 500 stacks of items, so you frantically stuff it with whatever you can find and you'll still have extra room. I set up some circuit logic to load the rocket based on requests. I would argue that from now on, circuits are necessary. Yes, you can finish the game without them, but launching a rocket without circuit logic is like driving a car without a steering wheel. Also, make sure to have a thruster suit and life support canisters so you can breathe in space. But other than that, you're on your first new surface, and I loved cleaning it up. The fact that you get a small boost with a handful of more powerful belts and solar panels is really cool. If you found the weapons cache that your first satellite should have found, you also have a handful of requester chests. This sort of makes up for the fact that you can't make them, but you need to be very stingy. In my case, I also got a requester warehouse, which might look kind of funny, but is actually a godsend in space. Space has a limited amount of space, mostly limited to the small asteroid that you've crashed on. If you've made and brought scaffolding, you can expand this a little bit, but scaffolding is pretty expensive and you probably didn't think to bring a lot of it. In any case, this large requester warehouse was used to supply everything for making the first space science, called space science, in a small area. You will need lots of lube, which can sort of only be brought up by steel barrel, which is very inefficient. Each barrel only supplies 50 of any liquid, which is about a single drop. And the space conveyor belts and pipes, the only kind that can be used in space, need lube along with copper, steel, and plastic in their relatively expensive manufacturing costs. Delivery cannons suck. They can bring a limited set of items from Navis to orbit, one stack at a time, and will also consume a relatively expensive delivery capsule. Many of the expensive things you want to send, like big electric motors, can't be sent, and the price per item is really high. Yes, cargo rockets are really expensive and need 500 stacks of items to feel worth it, but they are miles more efficient. Except for the very start where my assistant Sir Wazzle shot a list of items at me.
Oh my god, a red warning shows up when you send stuff at me.
It's like firing artillery at you. There goes.
I didn't use them, and I don't think they're worth using. Space Science 1 isn't too hard of a recipe to set up, but you might start noticing something overarching about space. Everything is worse. while underground red belts are like 12 in length in this mod, which is amazing. Space underground belts are 5, the same as yellow belts. Underground pipes on Navis are 16 in length, while underground pipes in space are 6 in length. This, coupled with the ultra-limited space you can build with, is debilitating. Working with solids is cramped, and working with fluids is a flat-out nightmare. Fluids in vanilla Factorio are already a weak point in my opinion. The way they flow and can't get mixed together, and only one fluid per pipe always felt annoying. That being exacerbated is a challenge to say the least. You really need to plan out where your fluids are going because lube is just the tip of the iceberg. So you have limited space and belts and pipes suck. This would be a perfect spot for logistic robots, right? Well, no, the robot attrition modifier is basically maxed out up here. If you have more than 50 robots in the network, they will seriously drop like flies. While 50 bots do help, and I think they are the best for early game space manufacturing, that is your hard cap. At the moment, bots are still real slow, so I guess a set it and forget it mindset is what you need to go with. I get that space should be a challenge and there isn't that much you need to do up here at the moment, but these restrictions only get more annoying as time goes on. The most annoying are the underground lengths for belts and pipes. I seriously think they should be increased. There is so much you need to do in space. You really don't need to be nerfed into the ground in addition. Anyway, cosmic water is needed for science. Thankfully, normal water can be mined up here from the water ice and melted into water, and all of the rest of the science on Navis needs to be sent to space to be processed from now on. Figuring out how to balance all 5 of the normal sciences that get loaded into the rocket and sent up periodically is a fun circuit challenge. If you don't like using circuits, this is where you can stop playing. Without circuits, certain things that have yet to come will take... well, actually, they might be impossible. Whatever, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We got bigger fish to fry at this point. Namely, all the empty barrels from the gallons of imported lube. They stack to only 10 and fill up chests in no time. Well, they can be recycled for steel. This might sound like a small detail, but it is incredibly helpful, and it scratches a recycling itch that vanilla Factorio doesn't. I am in love with the fact that the steel is made into a barrel to carry a fluid to space, then broken down into steel again so it can be used for something else, like the metric tons of scaffolding we'll have to make. It makes the steel feel so purposeful, like it has its own story. In fact, recycling is one of the key themes in space. There is so much more to come with recycling, and every time it came up, it felt amazing. Also, all the scrap we cleaned up can be recycled randomly into stone, copper, or iron ore, and sometimes heavy oil. At first, you don't know what to do with all the ore and oil in space. It feels like you should send it back to Navis to be smelted, but just keep piling it up here. It'll be useful. In fact, if you find yourself with an abundance of anything in space, just keep it up there. It'll eventually be used in something. And for those wondering, do I like the aesthetic of bots frantically flying everywhere with space labs behind, having a disco party next to a spaghetti pile of pipes and belts and inserters all cramped on a small asteroid? Thank you for asking. Yes, I would call this ideal. The last thing for now is setting up recycling for your air canisters. They get contaminated and need to be decontaminated, leaving you with contaminated sludge that can be decontaminated to make more sludge that can be decontaminated to make normal sludge. What can you do with the normal biosludge? Well, for now, nothing. You don't breathe that fast, so it's not at risk of overflowing, but the fact that breathing generates a resource, one that nothing else can make at the moment nonetheless, really intrigued me. Once you figure out how to automatically send science to space, you can see them dropping in, and it always got me hyped. It's like, I'm actually spacing now. I'm actually an adult. Yeah, what? Wait, I have to pay taxes? Anyway, space science is complete, so we can now go home in our dinky space capsule. We've explored space and we're done. Is what I wish I could say, but we have something far more sinister on the docket. Water electrolysis. Water is a free resource. Separating it into oxygen and hydrogen just requires these fancy new buildings, so what's the big deal? Well, there's 2 things. First, it's slow and each building takes a ton of electricity. Second, it can't be efficiency moduled. You try to do it and you're just prevented. No explanation. It feels like such a slap in the face. It's like the creator of the mod was like, hey, just make electricity. Just, yeah, you have to do it. You can't, no, you can't use that tool that makes you use less electricity Because, okay, just make more. Now, when you Google it, it turns out there's an infinite energy loop you can do if the buildings use less electricity, so I don't think the intent was to hamstring you, it was more for balance. But if that's the case, just make these stupid things work 5 times faster than they do now. It feels so artificial to suddenly need to triple your energy just because of this one process. I've been told electrolysis is very energy intensive in real life, but I bet electric furnaces are too, and yeah, we covered realism. You really only need it for the oxygen to make rocket fuel, so the hydrogen awkwardly piles up in a fluid tank. Space research does give you air condensers to grab oxygen directly, which is more efficient and doesn't have a useless byproduct, but is still extremely energy intensive and also doesn't let you use efficiency modules, so yeah. At this point, you'll have sent satellites to a large chunk of your solar system. Many planets have populated the satellite view, and there's one question: who's first? Analyzing which planet to go to was such a fun process for me. There's so many new resources you can speculate about how useful they are. Planets have different concentrations of resources, different biomes, amounts of biters, modifiers like waterless and biter meteors. Choosing the right planet felt like being at a shopping mall. I felt so invested because for now it's not obvious how to get back from the planet, so making the wrong choice has massive consequences. Like all good leaders, I of course sent my assistant first to be safe. Wouldn't want anything to happen to me. The first planet we chose was a small and had no biters and was rich in oil. We were low on oil products, so the idea was to send back solid oil products like plastic and sulfur to provide more for Navis. Navis's job was to send cargo rocket sections and fuel to this new planet. This was inefficient to say the least, but the small size and lack of biters made it a great planet to learn on. We have a lot of great tools for power generation, resource smelting, assembler 2s, so packing the initial rocket with these supplies made setting it up much faster. And it was just fun to have your friend tell you about all the cool things they're finding. You can help them scout the planet and find resource patches in the satellite view, and I really like the discovery period. Multiplayer as a whole is a complicated subject. It's not all roses and sunshine. No. We had presidential debates about how to set up train systems and where to place certain parts of the factory. But for right now, it was pretty great. Iron and copper enriching is a great process to nerd out about if you like numbers. It provides a 25% boost to productivity when smelting with a 1-to-1 ratio for bars up from 4 to 3, but the productivity modules is where things get fun. We could make productivity module 2s at this point, which are much cheaper and worth using in this mod compared to vanilla, a fantastic change, and each chemical station is able to use 3 module slots. This is a 6% productivity bonus times 3, giving 18% productivity just for enriching the ores, which is multiplied by the 25% productivity from the smelting, giving a total boost of 48% more bars per ore if done this way. If you add 2 productivity modules to the electric furnaces, it jumps to 65%. Given how much resources we're going to need in the future, knowing each copper and iron mine lasts 65% longer was so satisfying. But I'm not done yet. Enriching ores produces dirty water, which can be turned into your choice of iron, copper, or stone. It's not a lot, but the extra trickle of resources will also be getting the enriching and productivity bonuses, which is great. It also implies that you can enrich iron and turn the dirty water into copper. So if you find yourself on a planet with iron but not copper, this is one way you can get a trickle of copper. Dirty water sounds useless in name, but it's pretty cool. You'll then find that you need to go to other planets for resources that are only on other planets. The first is Cryonite, and I made the grand decision of going to a planet with no water to send it back. I only then realized raw Cryonite stacks to 20, which is terrible. If you crush it, the powder stacks to 50, which is okay, but still really inefficient. Without water on the planet, I couldn't make Cryonite or rocket fuel, and I actually got stranded on this planet. I love the story of this. It was basically Interstellar.
Don't let me leave, Murph! No!
But it also feels like the Informatron should tell me the stack size of Cryonite before I make all these plans to send it back and get stranded. On the topic of waterless planets, I found them to be incredibly useless. Without water, you can't make rocket fuel, and in this mod, you can't process oil at all, so you're extremely limited in what you can produce and reliant on imports for cargo rocket sections and rocket fuel. Those stack to 5 and 10 respectively, so they are the least efficient things to have on import. Having water is something you don't think about until it's gone, and after that experience, I'm never going to a planet without water again. You could argue they're nice in the late game because at that point you can make and ship your own water ice to provide water, and they always don't have biters. They're probably okay at that point, but I also never set up a general purpose water ice rocket, and setting one of those up doesn't sound that appealing. This whole process did force me to control the bots back on Navis to spaghetti rocket fuel into a rocket silo to rescue me, which was a unique experience. I was definitely energized and thinking as fast as I could when I realized I was trapped, and figuring out that this was the only way to save myself was pretty cool. Also, getting home and having all the tools and resources back at your disposal did authentically feel like escaping from a crash landing on a deserted island, so I have to give them credit there. Back home, you have to set up lithium, which is more electrolysis, which sucks, let's be real here, but at least you have somewhere to use that mineral water from the core miner and a use for that hydrogen that's been building up. And then it's back to the moon. There's more science to be scienced. What? You thought space science was it? We have 28 more to go. We're in phase 1 of 8 for sciences, so buckle up. You should have enough cryonite to start turning it into space utility science. This will give you requester chests, which is transformationally powerful, so you should do it ASAP. You're introduced to a bunch more fluids with these biolabs, chemical gels, space oil processing, and most importantly, thermofluid. Thermofluid requires oil products, iron, copper, and chemical gel to be made. Once created, you'll need to cool it, use it in utility science, and then it outputs the thermofluid but at a warmer temperature. Thermofluid therefore needs to be handled as a cycle. Every time it is cooled, you do lose a little bit of thermofluid, but it also means you don't have to use as much. It does mean that your space pipe spaghetti is about to go completely insane. All this fluid nonsense was so time-consuming and dreadful. Worst of all, you're basically guaranteed to rebuild this once you get more scaffolding and better tools, so all of this work? Yeah, it's temporary. Ugh. The science cards in space also need data cards to become machine learning data to be used in science, which then get discarded as used or broken data cards. Yes, those are different, and can then be recycled back into blank data cards and go through the cycle to become machine learning data in science again. Each data card is fairly expensive, needing red circuits, stone products, and copper, but again, the recycling means the costs aren't quite as bad, and yay for recycling! But holy cow, thermofluid and data cards at the same time was a doozy. Thankfully, the next 3 sciences in this science phase use thermofluid and data cards, so if you have good enough infrastructure, it should be fine. Space also has 8 times better solar panels, and space buildings are usually 3 to 5 times faster than buildings on the ground, so that's very helpful. Space manufactories have a crafting speed of 10, and with 6 module slots for speed modules, you only need 1 for anything you're building. They are huge though. With requester chests researched, you should stop looking at this monstrosity and use them. A bot mall in space is basically necessary. There are going to be more than 30 new buildings with the most ridiculous crafting costs you can imagine. Belting those resources over here to make all of them would be a nightmare, so use the bot mall method instead. 1 requester chest, 1 passive provider chest, select what you want to make, shift right click the manufactory, shift left click the requester chest, and as long as your resources are in the bot network, it just works. The next resource is Vulcanite, and of course I sent my assistant to handle this. Vulcanite will be used to make production space science and can be used to make rocket fuel quickly, although the effort required to make Vulcanite suggests you should only do this on surfaces that mine and process Vulcanite. The planet we harvested Vulcanite from had core fragments that are crushed into Vulcanite stone and normal core fragments. For advanced resources, so far just Cryonite and Vulcanite, having a planet that core mines the resource is a great idea. It's an insurance plan for when the mine of the resource runs out. And then you notice that the density of these mines is absolutely massive. I think this is for 2 reasons. First, Vulcanite ore doesn't get you nearly as far as iron ore. It has 5 steps to its smelting, and the end result is much lower than 1 vulcanite ore per 1 vulcanite block. Second, advanced resources are much harder to find than normal resources. Vulcanite, for instance, requires this volcanic terrain, and even on planets that estimate there is vulcanite on them, if there is no volcanic terrain, there is no vulcanite. So I think the mod creators are throwing us a bone here, not requiring us to constantly find new vulcanite mines like we do with iron or copper. This also suggests that you should wait and scan your entire solar system before choosing a planet to mine vulcanite from. If you only need one planet to mine vulcanite, it might as well be the best planet to mine vulcanite. While my assistant was off assisting, I made a more industrial bot mall at home. This one will be doing a lot more than the one in space. Once production is high enough, I stopped caring about robots over 50 crashing. It's just a small nuisance at this point. And there is now a gargantuan amount of complicated recipes only needed a small number of times that have been begging for requester chests to save them.
Yellow, red, and blue belts, underground splitters, and loaders. That's 12 things, mind you. Burner, normal, fast, a stack, and stack. Filter, inserters, burner, space, and assembler, 1, 2s, and 3s. Burner, electric, electric miner, 2s, core miners, stone, steel, electric, and industrial furnaces, casting machines, automation cores, electronic components, inserter parts, batteries, copper cable, iron gears, sticks, and beams, steel gears, and beams. Speed and productivity modules 1 and 2, efficiency modules, small and electric motors, single and multi-cylinder engines, steel chests, warehouse, fluid tanks, passive provider chests, requester chests, passive provider warehouses, storage warehouses, recyclers, pulverizers, air condensers, water filtrations plants, water electrolysis plants, fuel refineries, chemical stations, centrifuges, oil refineries, locomotives, cargo wagons, fluid wagons, rail signals, rail chain signals, train stops, logistic train stops, train tracks, solar panels, accumulators, steam engines, steam turbines, boilers, nuclear reactors, heat pipes, heat exchangers, oil pump jacks, mineral water pump jacks, offshore pumps, labs, space labs.
Thank you, past me. You can sit down now. I know you weren't even finished. I've got a review to complete. But it is true. There are way too many buildings in this mod. Vanilla Factorio nailed the number of buildings. It feels like each one has multiple uses. There aren't too many or too few. I know that there are a lot more things in this mod to make, so there probably should be more, but some buildings literally have one recipe. I'm sure there's more that goes into how many buildings we'd end up with, but it gets so tiring trying to remember where a recipe out of literal thousands gets made. Anyway, the next thing I pushed toward was Iridite and Immersite, 2 new advanced resources. Immersite is fairly complicated and Iridite is extremely complicated, and slow, and stacks poorly. It took a massive amount of effort to figure out how Immersite and Iridite work together on the same planet, but when I did, it clicked so well. These processes are littered with outputs, and it just so happens many things that Immersite outputs can be used in Iridite and vice versa. It was honestly a complex beauty I hadn't really experienced in a game before. It's so hard to explain the crazy nonlinear ways that these processes intersect and feed one another. I was also glad to get this done fairly early. I could have gone off and started beryllium, but Iridite is so slow that having this process run in the background while I went off and did other duties ended up helping a ton. I really like this flexibility. After Vulcanite and Cryonite, there are 2 other advanced resources I could have gone after as well, Holmanite and Vitamelage, and it allows a ton of freedom. At the same time, there is an implied order based on recipe complexity: beryllium, then Holmanite, then Iridite, then Vitamelage. You get a nudge in a direction, but also freedom to deviate from it, and I think it works incredibly well. Not only in practice, but what happens in your imagination as you start to theorycraft the best order to tackle these resources. Very cool. I struggled with energy in the new resource production recipes. Burning fuel just doesn't get you very far. I think nuclear is what the game wants you to do, but shipping uranium around the universe seems like such a chore. I'm way too lazy for that. So lazy, I'm willing to do more labor. Funny how that works. I haven't touched on biters yet, but in the early game with the more expensive smelting of iron, they can be quite a nuisance. But at this point, you should have laser turrets, and at least on Navis they should be manageable, but also make venturing outside your walls slow. If you disable biters, it only disables them on the starting planet, and I honestly recommend it. One way or another, you're going to run into biters in the solar system, and with the slower start, there are just another thing slowing you down. But eventually, Factorio 2, and in our case Aircrafts, gifts you toys for dealing with them in new, more efficient ways that I appreciate. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Then I went for beryllium. Being an advanced resource, it has many similarities with Iridite. This one requires Cryonite, and therefore I looked hard for a planet with beryllium, Cryonite, oil, and no biters. Thankfully, the perfect planet existed and I was rewarded for my analysis. Beryllium isn't as complex as Erudite, but still has 4 crafting steps. This was when landing on and setting up new planets really started to click for me. I knew the list of things to bring, I set basics up fairly quickly, starting with power, then rails, then mines, then a core miner blueprint. It was all really smooth, and although it took a while, I think this is where setting up planets really peaked for me. If the game ended after this planet, it would have been nice, but look at the time left on this video, we got some things to cover. Once the planet was set up with a rocket to export Cryonite and Beryllium, I realized this planet is actually blessed with a 3rd trait. As a moon, it is smaller than other planets, which might sound bad. Smaller might equal less resources, but it turns out this is actually great. Smaller planets are nice because they're easier to explore and take less rocket fuel to launch from, given their lower gravity. But they also take up less space in your save file, which is a funny thing to manage in a game like this, but given the complexity of everything that's happening, I don't mind it, and actually kind of like the save file optimization. It's like you're playing Factorio in the game and outside the game. Also, it's as easy as removing scanned planets you don't plan to go to. And although I wasn't thrilled about going to another new planet, Holmium was next on the docket. It's hard to convey the fatigue you have in this relatively short review format, but it was really starting to get grindy in a bad way. For example, this next planet I want to get Holmium from has all of the requirements I want. Fantastic, another good analysis rewarded. But that doesn't save you from the fact that you're going to crash land the rocket, lose 20% or more of the cargo, and worst of all, land somewhere random. With each of these planets, I had found a place I want to set up a factory at. Generally, it's near a core mining seam, whatever resource I want to harvest, in this case Holmium, an oil field, iron mine, stone mine, and copper mine if I can help it. But I don't have 500 inventory slots to carry the crashed rocket's cargo to where I want to go. This forces you to make an initial railway or base right where you landed, which I landed in the water. This step always felt so sluggish and annoying. I really wish I could have some say in where I landed at the very least. Losing the cargo isn't that big of a deal because nothing can be reduced below 1, so you at least have some of all the things you brought. As a side note, let's take a second to admire the planet generation. It's truly beautiful. Each biome looks awesome while balancing the resources across the map in a very even and natural way. I've played most of the game in a jet at this point, but if you're on foot, a lot of the biomes do slow you down, which I'm not a fan of. Yes, it's realistic. No, I don't have to beat that horse anymore. Anyway, time to set up all the basics for the 5th time. It really takes a long time to set these up, and possibly the biggest offender are cargo rocket sections. Their long crafting chain haunts you from the dead, planet after planet, rearing its ugly head to remind you of all the crap you have to make before you can ship things off the planet. Even with a blueprint that made all the cargo rocket section parts, it's still annoying because you have to set up processing for iron, copper, stone, oil, wood, and steel just to feed it into the machine. Any way that you slice it, they are annoying. Now, there is a possibility to make them on a single planet and just have them imported from that planet, but that sounds so awful. I tried doing this on Navis, and it just takes away too much resources from the starting planet's already strained responsibilities for the space labs. If we want to make this mod less grindy and more friendly to people who want to finish the game as a hobby instead of a career, cargo rocket sections might be the biggest offender. I would remove 2/3 of their crafting chain and also make rocket launches take 10 rocket sections instead of 100. And even with this, the game would still take absolutely forever to finish, but at least new planets could focus on the new resources instead of the same 40-step crafting chain you've done for the 5th time. So then at some point you finish Home Night realizing it's a copy Erudite's homework but change a few of the things so the teacher doesn't know situation. One thing they both use is nitric acid. I've been trying not to swear this video, but f*** nitric acid. That's all you need to know. Okay, so now we're importing a ton of stuff to space. Navis has 5 sciences, iron, copper, and a ton of other stuff, and the other planets are now sending vulcanite, cryonite, beryllium, erudite, imersite, and now holmium. There's a growing sensation that 2 things need to change. I might be projecting, but your factory in space is probably crap. It's not your fault, it's just the necessity of the situation. The second thing is there is a growing problem. There's a many too many logistics problem coming up. Rockets with many different resources want to land in space and load into some type of system that can handle many resources. The many resources in storage then need to find their way to buildings in space which want many different resources for their recipes. This is a very tricky problem to solve. What I wanted was an unloading station that any rocket could land at that could handle its resources and load them into a single LTN train station that any train could load from and provide for the rest of the network. This, objectively, is not a solution you should try to do. It's bottlenecked, hard to set up, it functions worse than something that takes 1/5 the effort, but let me tell you something. Sometimes it's about building what your heart desires. The Eye of Sauron Intergalactic Unloading Station handled every single rocket unload in space for the rest of the game. Didn't matter the planet, didn't matter the resource, everything was handled here. And this thing was such an uber highlight for me. Rockets naturally unload in these rainbow patterns, and to sort, the inserters essentially pass resources in a loop until they land in the specific warehouse they're supposed to be in, so this thing absolutely tweaks out. And sometimes you get lucky and have 2 rockets unload at the same time. I know this isn't the highest quality footage, but if this doesn't do something for you, honestly, I don't know why you're still here. Hello. The mod doesn't push you to make this happen, but credit where it is due. K2SE taketh, and sometimes K2SE giveth. This was genius. I could stare at that thing all day, but look at the time. We've already been here for 200 hours. We've got to move on to the last advanced resource. I like Vitamelange. Similar to Vulcanite, it has a fuel value, so you can burn it for power. The giant mistake I made was going to a planet about 10 times farther away than all the other planets because it was in a different solar system. This planet had Vitamelange, Cryonite, and Vulcanite, all necessary for the full Vitamelange process, but at this distance it takes 600,000 rocket fuel to get back. That's an absolutely insane amount. Also, this planet took the longest to fully set up by a mile. Our astute planning allowed us to avoid biters on every planet except our starting one. Unfortunately, with Vitamelange, this is not possible. If a planet has Vitamelange, it has biters and biter meteors. Oh boy. Biter meteors are like the normal meteors we've had to defend from with meteor installations that shoot them down. Shooting down a meteor is a chance-based activity. Each meteor installation has 80% accuracy. What this means is you are never 100% safe from a meteor. This is the worst designed thing in the game. You know how slot machines are designed to keep you playing by rewarding you with a variable reward schedule? This is that, except if the slot machine pulled a gun and shot you instead of paying you. You live with the dreadful reality that at any point a biter meteor could hit a planet, spawning biters and destroying everything that is not guarded with turrets. Yes, they generally occur on planets with biters anyway, but are you going to put turrets everywhere? Factories are getting pretty big and laser turrets have a 10 megawatt draw when they're not firing. I can't afford that. There's nowhere to hide. Biter meteors are so awful, they might be a war crime. Nothing redeemable about them. We're moving on. I tried killing all the biters on the Vitamelange planet with my jet, but it was futile. It's about 4 times bigger than Navis, and the biters expand and regenerate faster than I can kill them. Also, there are temples. I was intrigued and terrified. That's all I'll say for now. Once I realized I couldn't kill all the biters, I set up a factory on a Vitamelange core seam, Vulcanite mine, and Cryonite mine, which felt very powerful. 3 advanced resources in 1. The problem became how big the factory was, including all the remote mines that needed defending. The factory was one problem, but I was forced to set up a solar farm at the place I crash landed, which was extremely far away from the factory. Defending both of these was a nightmare. I feel like I've had a ton of nightmares at this point. I wish there was a word for a group of nightmares. A cacophony of nightmares? Anyway, this was one filled with biters attacking and flanking by laser turrets like Roman generals. I'm fairly certain there's a clinically significant chronic rise in my blood pressure just as a result of this planet. This pushed me to do something I had always wanted to try but couldn't justify. Artillery train checkpoints. Artillery wagons exist in vanilla, but unless you want to make a mega factory, you can get by with just stationary artillery turrets. They are perfect on this planet though. What I did was place logistic train stops strategically close to my mines. These checkpoints were surrounded by walls and laser turrets with a roboport to defend them. If biters ever did manage to damage the walls, construction bots would repair the wall, consuming a repair pack. This would trigger the train to drop off more repair packs, and while it was doing so, fire artillery from the artillery wagons at all nearby biter nests to prevent attacks in the future. This system, chef's kiss, I loved everything about it. Funnily enough, you can do this with LTN and base Factorio. You don't need K2SE at all. But K2SE provided the environment for this to happen, so points where they are deserved. With the planet defended, I continued toward making Vitamelage. It's worth noting that all these security checkpoints use a ton of electricity, and I would eventually return to add nuclear power, as even advanced solar panels and burning excess Vitamelage ran into issues during big attacks. Also, Vitamelage forces you to balance its final two outputs, extract and spice. You make much more spice, but can convert as much of it into extract as you would like. This was a cool balancing exercise, and also reinforced the Eye of Sauron in space I built to handle rockets with more than one type of resource. It was nerve-wracking leaving the first factory that could be attacked by biters, and any gaps I missed in the walls, biters would attack relentlessly, and the attack jingle just about made me throw my computer out the window.
Oh, and apparently, unless you full wall, biters just walk around your defenses like they're robbing a bank. I was so pissed to see this. These stupid worms just slithering around. Aren't you supposed to be stupid?
In Vanilla Factorio, you can just go to where they are attacking and stop the issue. In K2SE, in my shoes, I'll need to pile up another 600,000 rocket fuel while I watch hopelessly as they destroy the factory I made. Remember that space rebuild I was talking about? With all advanced resources being sent to space, it's time to finally do it. Planning how and where to build the new space sciences is an extremely complicated endeavor, one that dwarfs everything else in the game. Except for maybe one thing. In retrospect, I think I did things in the wrong order. I've been making and sending advanced resources to space, but not actually using most of them. My idea was to process all of them and then do all of the space sciences at once. Each advanced resource is the main focus for one of the 4 space science fields in astronomics, energy, materials, and biological. These space sciences are independent to an extent and yield very powerful upgrades that make landing on and defending and generally handling resources much easier. I think the best way to do this might have been to process and send an advanced resource to space, then research as far as I can with that science, and move on to the next advanced material on another planet. This would have given me these upgrades earlier while also breaking up the monotonous landing and factory setting up process across time instead of all at once. There were some benefits to doing it this way though. I saw that data cards and thermofluid were going to be integral to all 4 branches of science and that there was some overlap between resource inputs for the sciences. This pushed me to make 4 vertical spaces for the sciences with a 5th in the middle to handle the data cards and thermofluid. I also realized that astronomics and energy seemed to have a lot in common while material and biological also had a significant overlap. It turns out they all have overlap to some extent, but I think I benefited greatly from the design decision to put astronomics and energy on one side and material and biological on the other. This part was incredibly engaging. Yes, I have more work to do than I can fathom, but the planning was great. The centralized data card manufacturing and recycling and thermofluid production and cooling facilities felt like such purposeful design decisions far beyond the bounds of Vanilla Factorio. The data cards were much cooler. It ended up with a centralized warehouse to store data cards flowing out east and west with used, broken, and damaged data cards flowing in to get recycled. It felt like a heart pumping blood in and out of the factory. Thermofluid was similar, but it's a fluid, and fluids still suck. They're also a lot less visible, so although it was happening in a similar manner, it wasn't the same as seeing a flow of data cards coming in and out and the research bar ticking up. Speaking of research, I got to cross another line off my bucket list: sushi science. Sushi means that each type of science shares the same belt. With over 30 different sciences, this might sound impossible eventually, but circuit logic to the rescue. There's a way to set an exact amount of each science you want flowing on the belt at the same time. As long as it goes in a circle, each lab will eventually get fed all of the sciences. Also, this tier of Space Lab is a giant disco ball. It doesn't make any sense. It looks phenomenal. I absolutely love these things. You are looking at peak design. You'll have to start handling the increased scrap that the new sciences produce. This was very fun. You essentially get a refund of various basic ores and can start to figure out what to do with them. I tried feeding these into different places and found that they actually would overflow if I wasn't careful. After trying many things, I think the key here is to feed all of these resources back into data cards. Although you recycle a lot of them, you will constantly need to produce more of them, and each of the resources that you can recycle into, iron, copper, stone, and rare metal ores, are used in the data card recipe. When I rerouted everything out of there, it stopped overflowing and felt like the most natural way to continue the product scrap cycle. It was pretty frustrating to tangle with, but very satisfying to solve. Ingots are now the way to go for iron, copper, and steel. The smelting is 50% more efficient before we add the 5 productivity module slots advanced furnaces provide at the small cost of a little bit of pyroflux. Let's just call that a lot of productivity. Once I swapped over to ingots, the core miner on Navis was able to handle the resource demand for these 3 resources almost on its own. In addition, ingots are equivalent to 10 plates, so even though they only stack to 50, they are effectively 500 of the resource in question, much higher than the 200 that plates stack to. When you update to ingots, you will need to update all of the processes that were using plates with an additional convert ingots to plates recipe. This was a little annoying. I wish my productivity upgrade didn't come with a price to pay, but it's not terrible. Okay, on to space science. The topic is seemingly massive. 4 space science fields, each has 4 tiers, and each tier takes 4 data cards to make. That's 64 data cards, by the way, each needing advanced resources and fluids that get progressively more expensive as you go up the tiers. It's just so insanely long to go through all 64 in a row, but that's pretty much what I did. Here's the kicker. These sciences may have different recipes, but in a way they are all the same. Blank data card plus advanced resource material plus some other materials equals some data card. Once you get 4 data cards, use them to make the catalogs of whatever field and tier you are in, then use the catalog to make insights, the insights to make significant data, combine catalogs, insights, and significant data, and an advanced material made from an advanced resource, and you finally have a true science pack. Repeat this 16 times. Yes, the 64 different data cards indeed have different recipes, but they are formulaically similar and thus can all be covered at once. Each time it was a grind to go through this 4 data card catalog insight significant data process. Maybe the first time it was rewarding, but it was just a boring slog the next 15 times. The design here hit a low point. This is a combination of laziness and padding the runtime by a stupidly long amount, which is exactly the last thing this mod needed. If I could change it, I'm not exactly sure what I would do, but it would be significantly less complicated and take significantly less time to set up. I'll give props and say that the science itself looks phenomenal. The vibrant colors of all the buildings and resources flowing on belts is gorgeous. Each field has its own theme. Astronomics is blue, energy is pink, biological is green, and materials is brown to orange. And each branch glows and radiates these different colors as they chug through materials. I loved how it looked. The science upgrades ranged from whatever to game-changing. Each catalog and science pack needs to be researched individually, and I don't know how I feel about researching. The ability to research more research feels unnecessary. But some researches are genuinely incredible. The first of which is the space elevator. This essentially connects a surface to the space above its planet by allowing trains to travel between the surfaces and also connects their power grids, both of which are amazing. This reduced the amount of rockets I needed to send from Navis, which sent by far the most amount of rockets, and allowed the power grid in the sky with its 8 times better solar to provide for the now massive factory on the ground. You can now safely deconstruct the original space factory you had set up. There was something nice about freeing myself from the past. At the same time, watching literal dozens of hours of your past life dissolving into nothing is pretty depressing. But let's think about something less depressing. Toward the end of the 64 data card hell, you can start making spaceship parts. If you've scanned your solar system, you'll notice that the closest asteroid belt has a broken spaceship just sitting there. You can't look inside the chests because this isn't your item, which was confusing because this mechanic only pops up in PvP, I think. It turns out inside the chests are the parts that can fix the spaceship and run it. And here is the biggest spoiler of them all. If you launch your very first rocket here, you can play the entire game starting with this spaceship. When I realized this, it was a pretty bittersweet moment. On one hand, the mystery of this thing sitting here, not sure if it's worth visiting, is really cool. You can start the game with a spaceship. Strangely enough, a spaceship in the early game doesn't have many applications, so it's not actually that important. But there is one very important application, which is the ability to fly above a planet before landing and drop off a cargo rocket landing pad on the planet. This means I never would have needed to crash land on a planet, and I could have always chose where to land my cargo rocket. I was devastated. I felt like I had wasted so much time cleaning up and moving resources to where I actually wanted to land on each planet. I think this is a little too cryptic. A whole spaceship is really powerful. The difference between having this ability and not is massive, but it's hidden behind what feels like an Easter egg. I would have preferred if the Informatron hinted at or even straight up told you that there was a spaceship that might be able to be fixed out there. Or if the Easter egg was not something that was a powerful game-changing function, like if there was a teddy bear out here or whatever. I feel weirdly like I've been scammed with the current setup. Spaceships as a whole, though, are very cool, top marks for creativity and functionality. There is a learning curve to the circuit logic required to launch them, but realizing how free you are to set this logic up and have spaceships do whatever you want was so enjoyable. They have size and storage limits based on your current research and even set their speed based on the number of engines you have, aerodynamics of the shape of your ship, and even the weight of the cargo on board, so they don't feel overpowered. They're great when automated, but flying in them is pretty boring. You just sit there while asteroids fly at your ship. It's not unheard of to have a spaceship trip be 30 minutes one way, so I wish there was something you could do on a ship to make it not feel like a waste. The Informatron mentions the satellite view, but there's only so much you can do in the satellite view, and I generally AFK'd if a long trip was necessary. I should also mention that cargo rockets and spaceships have extended the number of resource transportation tools to 5. Vanilla provides the other 3 in belts, trains, and logistics bots, and cargo rockets and spaceships fill in functionality that belts, trains, and bots don't have. Cargo rockets excel at high throughput ground-to-space travel if you can't use a space elevator, while spaceships are more flexible in what they can deliver, and for trips that don't land on a planet like Navi's orbit to an asteroid belt, they can deliver resources at a tiny fraction of the cost of cargo rockets. There is a massive fuel penalty for trying to make a ship take off from a planet, and you're forced to use rocket fuel instead of the more effective ion fuel, so it's generally less effective than cargo rockets for transporting advanced resources to space. Creating this new design space and filling it so elegantly really impressed me. K2 adds advanced assembling machines and advanced chemical stations. These are bigger, faster, and the chemical stations have additional module slots compared to the standard buildings. This really isn't that complicated of a change, but having a machine that just goes brrr and spits out a blue belt of green circuits with 34% productivity from productivity modules feels so good. I don't care if it's overpowered, these things are so awesome. The advanced chemical stations even have a giant spinning thing on them, which is so fun to watch when they get going really fast. Of course, getting these buildings to go fast requires speed modules in beacons, which have been overhauled. Each machine can only be affected by one beacon, but each beacon provides much more of the module's effect than it had in vanilla. This is a fantastic change. Trying to crowd a machine with a beacon in vanilla is kind of fun, but it gets crowded and janky quickly. With wide area beacons, it's really refreshing to see 20 plus buildings in its area affected. Modules also now go up to tier 9 and are generally cheaper to upgrade. Vanilla, for some reason, has an incredibly high cost to upgrade modules to level 2 and 3. Reducing these costs early is a great change and makes them really worth using. Also, landing on new planets and struggling to generate power makes efficiency modules actually useful in this mod, which I love because in vanilla, they're basically useless. Unfortunately, modules are also disappointing in many situations where they can't be used with no explanation. Productivity modules are essentially banned in space except for in research labs, and efficiency modules can't be used in the electrolysis operations. This is extra frustrating because these are 2 of the most effective places both of these modules could be used. I said it before, I'll say it again. If you give me a tool, it will feel terrible if you take that tool away, especially if you fail to explain why. Another amazing tool we've been given that I grossly underutilized are air filters. These remove the pollution in the air with filters that eventually need to be cleaned, yielding dirty water in the process. This slows down and even stops biter attacks altogether when placed strategically, and we know how much I love dirty water. The implications with this is now we can take the pollution in the air, capture it with filters, and then turn it into our choice of iron, copper, stone, or rare metals. You don't get dirty water that fast, so it's not a large amount of any of these resources, but the implications are hilarious and really made me wonder if generating pollution was now a net positive. But some of the most fun I had was with sunbeaming. It transforms biter planets from off-limits to playgrounds. Solar panels built around the orbit of the sun are over 16 times more effective than usual. That energy can be focused with a giant magnifying glass and burn biters' nests from 93 million miles away. After all the biter nonsense I've had to deal with, this was cathartically enjoyable. Almost too enjoyable. The beam deals heavy damage and applies a burn over time. If you set it to auto-target, it slowly repositions, burning everything in its path while you sit back and watch. But that's not even the best part. Once you clear a landing zone to land at, the space laser doubles as a nuclear reactor on steroids. With an energy beam receiver, you can easily generate over 1 gigawatt, which was the average power draw across all my factories. The space laser really feels like what an endgame upgrade you've been building towards should be. This thing is genius, and certainly an amazing payout for Energy Science 4. I had thought I was reaching the end anytime now for the last 200 hours. I hit 5 different waves of burnout, and at some point my body burnt out from burning out, and I just sat there with the absence of emotions, clicking on the screen, trying to push forward. This review format betrays the true experience. I didn't have aesthetic B-roll that transitioned every few seconds. I had the same isometric view that only moved when I moved. I didn't have pleasant background music. I had silence interrupted by the occasional blare of the attack siren. It's really a shame too, as you move from the mid-game to the end-game, the challenges, tools, and overall experiences by all metrics have been going up. I just blitzed through like 5 amazing, unique, fun tools I thoroughly appreciated, and I haven't even gotten to the best part. But the grindiness, the repetitiveness, it had made me numb. All that energy to explore and play with the new toys was gone. I just wanted to get to the end. But there's still multiple wings of the game to push through, and I was crazy enough to keep charging. If you ever want to play through this mod, do not try and rush through it. Know that you're going to be here for a long time, and take your time. From here on out, things are less grindy, much more unique, but also much more challenging. As if orchestrating 21 sciences and a dozen or so planets you've landed on by now wasn't enough. The 16, I'll just call them core space sciences, are accompanied by 2 tiers of matter science and 2 tiers of advanced science. Matter science focuses on the ability to turn things into matter and matter into things, and advanced science focuses on being advanced. One big change I would make is simply the order that you get matter upgrades. You start out with the ability to turn particle stream into most ores. The problem is, particle stream is so expensive to make, and it takes so much particle stream just to make a handful of ores that the recipe is worthless. Farther down the line, you get the ability to do the reverse, turn ores into particle stream. This is incredibly useful. As I just mentioned, particle stream is expensive, but it's also a fairly advanced research, and by the time you get it, you should be using it, but it's like the end of the game. It might have just been the order I tackled science in. It's technically available after you can create tier 2 of every core space science, and I got it at tier 4 of every core space science. But still, I would have liked to have some applications for generating ores with particle stream with the Matter 1 recipe. And then it's on to the final branch of sciences. You've plowed through 25 sciences, and there are only 4 more. Accompanying these is a final resource Naquitite found only in asteroid fields, found only far away from your solar system. Your large stockpile of sciences allows you to make spaceships up to 5 times larger than the original limit, and you're going to need it. Preparing a ship to have enough engines, fuel, power generations, shields to block asteroids, and of course aesthetics. Making this ship feels critical. If this ship doesn't make it, you're stuck floating in space for a long time, maybe forever. It was an important duty to take my time and make the ship correctly. At this point, my partner had long since burnt out and moved on to focus on other things. Things felt lonely, but at least I had the bots and inserters to pretend to keep me company. It's one thing to feel socially alone, and another to barrel into the void, knowing you're physically alone. I'm not a fan of the long spaceship rides. There's nothing to do, but the ambiance and mood of flying into the void is captured perfectly here. You've just spent 400 hours making a factory work. You're willing to risk everything just to progress the factory. That's hard to fake. Asteroid fields are a massive cacophony of islands with a small set of resources not including water, oil, or anything related to signs of life. Getting lost is a certainty, but the only reason you're here is to get the new valuable black substance and get out. Space rails differ themselves from normal rails by being able to be placed in space. Connecting fractured islands of Naquitite with trains is so cool, and jetpacking across islands is as fun as it is nerve-wracking. Once you land on this set of floating islands, you realize what it really is, a playground for all the tools you've acquired so far. I loved setting this base up. It was essentially finding the closest Naquitite mines and connecting them to a spaceship landing zone by a web of space rails. I think generating power out here is supposed to be more difficult, but I wisely scanned deep space for the closest asteroid field I could find. It was, in fact, 3 times closer than my Vinamlage planet, and even close enough to beam energy in from the sun. Not close enough for solar panels, mind you, those are set to 1/100th effectiveness. Asteroid belts are covered in uranium, so I imagine the devs intended that you make a power plant, or they just had it as a backup. Either way, the flexibility was nice. I felt rewarded for choosing this asteroid field specifically. You'll also need to collect probe data out here, which is a nice touch. For past sciences, you've needed to probe asteroid fields and the sun, which is very thematic. On your way out, you'll notice Naquitite ore only stacks to 10 and crushing it only stacks to 20. Then you'll look at its crafting recipe and realize it takes every single advanced resource. There are not only 6 steps, but 2 of the steps are non-linear, which I didn't even realize was possible. All of the advanced resources get sent to Navi's orbit and take a train down to the space elevator to Navi's surface, so this was an obvious place to send the Naquitite. Each spaceship can return a warehouse of Naquitite, which might sound like a lot until you realize it's going to make about 100 ingots. But this gets improved a lot if you use productivity modules on each step. They're incredibly expensive, but I use productivity module 7s for each step, greatly increasing the yield. The biggest wrench in this operation is that non-linear step I mentioned earlier. Refined Naquitite and Naquitite powder are made from crushed Naquitite in one step, but there are 2 recipes for that step. One takes cation exchange beads, makes more refined than powder, and outputs anion exchange beads. The other takes anion exchange beads, makes more powder than refined, and outputs cation exchange beads. This means both of these recipes need to be balanced so that you don't end up with too many of an exchange bead, refined, or powdered Naquitite. Then you need to make Naquitite crystals from the powder and refined. This is also a balancing operation as Naquitite ingots are made from refined, powdered, and crystals, so you can't just turn everything into crystals. At the same time, crystals are a product used in certain recipes, so some of the crystals also need to be exported. It makes a lot more sense when you actually do it. The first Naquitite ingot that gets produced feels very special. My favorite jewel is an onyx, so shiny black ingots sit comfortably at the apex of production in my eyes. But wait, we're still only bringing in 1 warehouse of Naquitite from a very long round-trip journey to an asteroid field. Won't this be very slow? Glad you brought it up. I literally copy and pasted 2 more blueprints of the ship, tripled the ore intake, and called it a day. I can't lie, I felt so smug about this. You can't even say it's low effort because I'll just tell you, I'm making a spaceship fleet. It's the perfect crime. Anyway, what does all this Naquitite do? Deep Space Science, the last set of 4 sciences. Deep Space Science 1 lulls you into a false sense of security. It's not that expensive, just need some ingots and crystals and you're good to go. Then Deep Space Science 2 rears its ugly head and you need to start making Naquitite cubes, and like the science packs before, Deep Space Science 2 needs the cubes and Deep Space Science 1. The same will be true for Deep Space Science 3 and 4, which are also multiplicatively more expensive on top of needing the previous sciences. Long story short, haul in Naquitite as fast as you can for as long as you can, never stop, it'll never be enough. To compensate, the rewards you research into are very powerful. At Deep Space Science 2, you get the ability to make antimatter, which is fairly cheap all things considered, and antimatter engines and reactors. The reactors consume canisters of antimatter to produce 400 megawatts of heat. This is mostly significant on spaceships, which up until this point had a hard time generating power. What I did previously was generate 5,000 degrees steam slowly at spaceship drop-offs, then load the spaceship with the steam while unloading the water, which is a byproduct from the high heat steam turbines. This works well even to get all the way to the asteroid field I'm working at, but was fundamentally limiting. With the antimatter reactors, I can now generate 5,000 degrees steam mid-flight, and the new bottleneck are the antimatter canisters, which stores something stupid like 10,000 times more energy than the one take of steam I was using before. The reason flying spaceships is necessary is due to one of the hardest puzzles that exists in all of gaming, arcospheres. You need to collect them at asteroid fields and they have diminishing returns, but that's not the hard part. The real challenge is using them. Unlike normal recipes, arcospheres are not consumed, just changed when used in a recipe. There are 8 types of arcospheres, and recipes will need certain types outputting a pseudo-random assortment of arcospheres with other types when they're done. That's all you really need to know for this video. In the last episode of my series, I spent over 20 minutes explaining the problem and the solution I came up with. It involved programming, crazy graphs, and a lot of combinators. My solution isn't perfect. I'm convinced nobody's arcosphere solution is perfect, but it worked and seemed to be fairly elegant as far as arcosphere solutions go. It just looks like these giant colorful things are spinning, but the fact that they're spinning means it works. I promise. And then there's Fenestra. I got super confused about one of the endings and wasted a ton of time here. Yes, there are multiple endings. Fenestra is one of them. No, I did not do it. No, I have no desire to do it. It takes like another 400 hours to do apparently. And I'll leave that one to whoever it's intended for, I guess. You'll notice antimatter consumption is through the roof, so you'll want to make a lot more of the precursor particle stream from ores. This would be all well and fine if it wasn't done in the worst building in the game, the Material Fabricator. It uses an insane amount of power, and not only can you not efficiency module it, you can't use any modules in it. Well, at least you can just make a lot of them, is what I would say if each one didn't cost 5 speed module 6s and 5 efficiency module 6s. This is so stupidly expensive. Efficiency modules may be easier to make in this mod, but these are still module tier 6s. I know efficiency modules are a little better in this mod, but efficiency module 6s? Why would you force me to make them? It's so painful. Using Material Fabricators just feels like getting curb stomped. They force you to make something incredibly expensive that you would otherwise not make, and then they can't be moduled, and then they use an insane amount of power. They honestly just feel goofy, like they were made for a different game and somehow accidentally got pasted into the source code. Get them out of my sight. But I did it. I paid the module toll. I have a ton of Material Fabricators, and now I'm off to mine asteroids. There are about 4 things left to do in the game, and we are only now doing the thing I imagined when I first started playing. Don't get me wrong, it was awesome. Mining asteroids while waiting for a queue of probe rockets to return more arcospheres felt so cool. All the different things you can do with your new pile of resources. Stone can be distributed across its dozen or so functions, or just make particle stream. Same with copper, iron, and the other minerals you find. Setting up a temporary mine on an asteroid is sublime, and spaceships can hold 4 warehouses at this point, so the haul is significant, but like, I wanted to be doing stuff like this literally 400 hours ago. And there's one more research to make. The factory is a giant pile of things that kind of work. You have no conscious memory of how you got here. You can't answer a single question about the factory, but if anything goes wrong, you're able to solve it in less than 2 minutes from muscle memory alone. You know delayed gratification is a good thing, but you're starting to wonder if dying before the gratification would make it still be worth it. This massive spaceship was in preparation for the endgame, but nothing compared to what it would actually take. Deep Space Science 4 takes way longer than it has any right to. It costs 5,000 research and the inputs are Deep Space Sciences 1 through 3. It just takes so long to research, waiting for all the Naquitite and Arcosphere spinning. Like many things in this mod, it really doesn't need to cost 5,000. You shouldn't have. While you're waiting for Deep Space Science 4, it's a good time to play around with matter. You can turn things into matter, similar to Particle Stream, and you can turn matter into things, but after working through all the steps it just isn't worth it. If you're on a planet, you can jump through 100 hoops to generate stone. Hooray! Except you could just mine stone. If you're in space, you can generate a bunch of ore, which is okay, but most things in space require finished products. You could replicate steps on the ground for dealing with ore, but given that you need things to make matter in the first place, it becomes mining, except with extra steps. It's really a shame. Generating resources looks so amazing, but it ended up just feeding itself to make more research. Ugh. But hey, at least Deep Space Science 4 is finished, and now we can move on to finishing the Factorio side of things. You get the ability to make a transceiver, and the transceiver requests power. It acts like an accumulator, but if the amount of power you give it is too low, it starts discharging, which is frustrating because you'd think this would be mentioned somewhere, but it's not. And no, this isn't hidden information. My character literally researched and created it themselves. They should know how the power works. Turns out you need a draw of at least 20 gigawatts, so I bribed my partner in crime to help generate some power.
Oh, nickel.
An entire nickel.
The way it shook out for us was actually pretty fun. I started with several matter reactors which generate 2 gigawatts of power each. These take a lot of Naquitite to make, so while they were building up, I made a sun beaming location and buffed up solar, while my 5-cent friend made some fusion reactors. We looked at the power chart every 5 minutes, watching it steadily rise with anticipation, and once we got it above 30 gigawatts, I threw the transceiver down and anxiously watched it build up. And then
Slamming the activate button when it comes up, like frame 1. Come on, it says
Gotta frame
100%.
perfect.
There we go, got it.
Maybe you shouldn't have put that in the center of the base.
the zoom in on the transceiver is forced upon you in-game, and I was in shock when it exploded. I thought it actually blew up the entire space base. Thankfully, it only destroyed a few splitters, and the rest of the space base was merely damaged. And by the rest, I do truly mean about 2/3 of everything up here. I couldn't stop laughing, seeing bots frantically try to fix everything at once. The insane amount of lag, getting trolled to this degree was actually hilarious. While my computer generated more heat than the sun, the last piece of the pie stared me down. Once I research this and then fly a ship for 10 minutes at 250 intergalactic speed units, the victory screen pops up. We already know how the story ends, but I really want to emphasize how difficult this last challenge is. Building a spaceship that fits into this perfect mold is incredibly difficult. Previously, I had built a spaceship to run at 250 intergalactic speed units for 10 minutes fairly easily. This time I need to do it while generating 6 extra gigawatts for the Nexus on board. Every spaceship I had built up until this point had only needed 1 gigawatt or less of power, so this is a massive jump. Generating power on a spaceship is much more restricted than on land. Sunbeaming can't target a moving spaceship, as cool as that would be. And singularity reactors have a debuff that adds an extra 2000 stress to the spaceship, making them basically useless because this mod needed to backhand you one last time on the way out. The only tool that really makes sense here are antimatter reactors, which I hate. I wish I could build whatever spaceship I wanted to finish the game instead of a very specific restrictive spaceship. Each high temperature heat exchanger that converts the heat from the antimatter reactors into energy generates 1 gigawatt, so you will need at least 6 to power the Nexus plus 1 more to power everything else. High heat exchangers are very awkward to work with. They intake high temperature steam and output water on the sides as well as normal temperature steam on the front side. Arranging 7 of them in the limited space that the spaceship affords is incredibly tricky. I thought a lot about fluid throughput because the steam per second that they intake and the water and low temperature steam that they output is very high, and if they aren't flushed out fast enough, they will clog and stop working. If you upgrade to 3000 spaceship stress capacity, getting them to fit while having enough engines to go at least 255 intergalactic speed units while making sure you're still aerodynamic and have enough shields at the front to block asteroids, and tanks to hold the fluid outputs, takes a truly insane amount of back and forth tweaking. I appreciate that as a final puzzle it's difficult, but 20 hours of back and forth felt terrible. One sneaky thing I ended up doing was avoiding the excess normal temperature steam because the amount of space that normal sized turbines take up to process was not worth the small amount of electricity they generated. A single biolab can handle all of the steam and convert it into water and put it back into the system, taking up substantially less space. And finally, I ended up with a build that actually did it and popped off appropriately. I suppose I felt a little accomplished, but the biggest thing I felt was relief. Not needing to play this game anymore was the true reward, unfortunately. There are so many amazing qualities that this game has, but simply put, they are not worth 550 hours to experience. It's just way too grindy for me, but does that mean that it needs to change? Thankfully for all of us, this is exactly what Space Age, aka Factorio 2.0 that comes out on October 21st, is supposed to be. K2SE sits in a special place, therefore. It walked so that this update could fly. It is the basis for this update. It was so inspiring, it caused the entire company to make the game go in its direction. I'm fairly certain that some of the modders who were a part of the K2SE team were hired to help make this happen. But don't quote me on that, I don't actually know the specifics, I just heard it from someone. The point is, where K2SE failed as a gameplay experience, it served as the backbone of a revolution in one of my favorite games ever made, highlighting new mechanics that could directly work and failed ideas that no longer need to be tested. Not to mention some of the best footage I could ask for. The art is incredible. For that, it will sit in a unique spot in my gaming career. Not a game I can recommend to play, but certainly one I respect and would recommend to study. If there is one game development company I trust, it is Woob, the creators of Factorio. I've been playing this game since 2018, consistently returning to find the game has incremental updates, better optimization, more features, and amazing quality of life changes. The Factorio devs time and time again have been able to do this while somehow preserving the original image of the game perfectly. I have never promoted a game before its release, and the amount of new features Space Age brings to the table classifies it as a new game in my eyes. I don't expect it to be perfect on release, but I do expect it to age like fine wine on the same shelf as Factorio 1. I'm personally most excited to get a group of friends to play 2.0, some of them for the first time, and see how far we can get as a democracy, so expect that during the first week of 2.0's release. I also have some very cool things to share in the not so distant future about 2.0, not to be secretive, but that's all I can say for now. There are many things that I missed across this run, and that is because I wanted this video to end at some point, and that point is now.